From battlefield to bomb shelter, from home front to hospital, from volunteer rosters to victims lists, women experience war in distinctive, gendered ways. These are their stories. These are their voices. Welcome to Voices of Women at Wartime, a podcast by the Center for Women's Justice in Israel. I'm Rachel Stomel.
And I'm Rivka Lubitch. Today we're interviewing Dr. Judy Melinek, who is a forensic pathologist living in New Zealand. She comes from an interesting background with a lot of Zionist history attached to it. I couldn't resist saying a few words about your family. Her father was a psychiatrist who served as a medic in the Yom Kippur War, and her mother was born in a Siberian refugee camp and was on the Haganah's boat, the Exodus. Recently, Dr. Melinek came to Israel for a week and volunteered at Israel's National Center of Forensic Medicine at Abu Kabir to help with identifying bodies or the remains of bodies from the October 7th attack. Hi.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. First of all, Judy, I want to ask you, what exactly is a forensic pathologist? So what is it that you do?
A forensic pathologist is a doctor whose specialty in medicine is investigating death. Specifically deaths that are sudden, unexpected, or violent. So to be a forensic pathologist, at least from the American mode of training, you have to actually first be trained as a hospital-based pathologist. You have to do, at the minimum, 3 years of training in a hospital setting, doing autopsies and also looking at what we call surgical pathology specimens or specimens in the laboratory. And so you have a basis in the laboratory sciences in diagnosing things like cancer or diseases, using your laboratory skills. So that would be the microbiology lab, the hematology lab, all the different laboratories of the hospital. And then you do an additional year of training in the United States, which is the pathway that I pursued, in forensic pathology. And I did my training at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. It just so happened that I was there in July. We start in July is the year for academics in the United States for doctors. So you start July 1st, and I started July of 2001. So I basically had 2 months of training, July and August, before September 11th happened. So my training year at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office involved 9/11, which was the biggest terrorist attack on American soil in history.
I was actually going to ask you about that later, the differences or something like that, but we'll get to that a little later. Can you tell us about what exactly you do? Like, just tell us something, because we don't know anything except for what we see on crime movies and stuff.
Yeah, CSI and those television shows. That's right. So the television shows tend to misrepresent what we do on a routine basis. The majority of cases that we do, a typical day for us is we come into work, and we usually have a list of people who have died in the past 24 hours. Or if we held them over the weekend on, let's say, a Monday, then we'd get the list of the people who died over the weekend. And usually it comes with some sort of basic scene information or police information that tells you where the body was found, who they're presumed to be, or who they are if they were identified. And it's a little bit about medical history, sometimes about, the medications that were found, or what the family could tell us about their health, their general health before they died. And then the first step is to go through the list of cases. It could be anywhere, depending on the size of the office, from, 2 cases a day to 10, in a big inner city office like the New York City office, you could have 10 or 15 bodies a day. But where I practice now in Wellington, New Zealand, it's not unusual for me to get 2 to 5 a day. And when I go through the material, I then have to make a decision. Do they need an autopsy or not? And generally, if the death is unexpected or sudden, they may not need an autopsy if they're elderly or they have known pre-existing medical conditions that could explain a sudden death. So as long as the death isn't suspicious in any way, we just do an overview of the medical records and look on the outside of the body to make sure that there isn't any concerning injuries. Okay, so that's called an external examination. But then there are going to be cases where there's trauma, or there's something suspicious, or they're just young and they weren't expected to die and don't have any medical history. So we have to figure out why they died. And for those, we do an autopsy. So an autopsy involves taking the organs, first doing the external examination as before to look for signs of disease or injury, and then taking the organs out one by one in a surgical way and measuring them and looking at them and slicing them and then putting them under the microscope to try to figure out if we can make a diagnosis. And the process of a typical autopsy on a routine case can take about 45 minutes to an hour. It's not very long, but the results can take months. And that's because we send things to a lab, and the lab has a turnaround time of about 2 or 3 weeks until we get the slides. And then meanwhile, every single day we get additional cases. So in a given period of time, in a given snapshot of a day, I may only have 2 or 3 autopsies that day, but I also have another 20 or so open cases that I need to close. And so I'm juggling those.
I'm going to hold you to ask you about what you did in Israel.
Right.
Tell us why you decided now to come across the world to Israel and to help us out.
Yeah. So I'm a forensic pathologist. I trained in New York City. I worked in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 20 years. And then at the start of COVID, I moved to New Zealand. And I've been in New Zealand for about 3 years working here. And after October 7th, obviously, everybody who has any connection to the Middle East or has family in Israel, as I do, is going to be affected by that. You know, I was watching it on the news. I was in contact with my family, and I had seen a few postings on social media. I think there was an advertisement on Facebook that was spread around among some doctors' websites or groups. And then I also saw it come in through my professional organization, the National Association of Medical Examiners, that they were looking for forensic pathologists to come. And it just so happened that I have a relationship that's been ongoing for about 15 years or so with Abu Kabir and with the Center for Forensic Medicine in Israel. The relationship is that 15 years ago, I showed up and said, "Hi, I'm a forensic pathologist and I speak Hebrew." And they were like, "Oh, come on in, have a tour. And oh, can we send you one of our fellows to do a rotation with you?" So one of their trainees actually came and trained with me in San Francisco. And then subsequently, when they needed someone to test their the doctors completing their credentials, they need to have outside international testers. They can't trust their own doctors to test them because it's biased. So they would have me.
I really want to hear about that. I saw in one of your talks that you gave that there's international monitoring. That's really important to hear about that.
Yeah, and there's international credentials that the trainees in Israel have to go through. So they're not only trained by their own staff, but they go and participate in international conferences. They do research that's internationally reviewed. And
but I mean that there's somebody monitoring it so that nobody can say that we make things up or add the numbers or change them. I mean, they'll say it anyway.
We'll talk about that. But yeah, listen, I mean, this is the thing. And we could talk about how we can counter that. So let's discuss that as a separate question. But basically what happened is because I had a relationship with the Institute and because I speak Hebrew and I can read Hebrew, I called them up and said, "Is this real? Should I sign up for this?" And they said, "Yes, it's real." Unfortunately, but yes, it's real.
Were you the only person that came? Were there a lot of other volunteers that came?
So there's an organization called APF, which I can't remember the full title of the organization, but it's a organization that's a nonprofit that was set up after the Yom Kippur War to develop relationships between American doctors and Israeli doctors and have cross-fertilization. So Israelis could go train abroad, but also so that volunteers could come from the United States to Israel, just in the case of another war. And they've never had to bring doctors in before.
We've never had a number of casualties all at once so many of them could not
exactly.
And in such a terrible situation. So tell us a little bit about the work here.
So this organization, by the way, had a list of doctors, but the list of doctors involved surgeons and emergency room physicians. It didn't have forensic pathologists, so they had to create the list. And a lot of people signed up. We had about 13 or 14 volunteers from the United States. So I was one of 4 Americans. I was the only one coming from New Zealand, but they did bring 3 other Americans as well.
Were the other ones also Jewish or?
Only one. 2 were not Jewish and 1 was Jewish and also spoke some Hebrew. So that was helpful. And I'll get to why having a little bit of Hebrew was helpful in our teams.
Tell us about the work. Like, it must be very different working on a body and working on the remains of this horrible, horrible things that happened there.
So I think one of the reasons why I was recruited and specifically chosen for this group, besides the fact that I could speak and read Hebrew, is because I had mass fatality experience. So I had the mass fatality experience in 9/11. American Airlines Flight 587 crashed in Queens also that year when I was training in New York. So I had that. And then when I was at the Alameda County Sheriff Coroner's Office, we had a big fire in a warehouse where there was an electronic dance music concert and 36 people died. So even though 36 sounds very small, but for, that's still considered a mass fatality incident. And I had handled recently here in Wellington, New Zealand, just a few weeks before October 7th, I had handled a case where 5 people had died in a fire. So I had this basic experience of being able to help identify either charred, massively traumatized, or decomposed remains in a mass fatality incident scenario. So I knew what to expect and how to handle these kind of types of cases.
I can imagine that emotionally, the difference here, it might have hit you differently.
There were some similarities to 9/11, and the similarities were the pulverization and the destruction of the bodies. I mean, we're dealing sometimes with such charred remains that it's unlikely that we'll be able to even confirm that people are dead. Some DNA will not necessarily come back because when you burn things so thoroughly, then it destroys the DNA. So we're going to have to make there's probably going to have to be some presumptive deaths of people who don't come back. And maybe we're assuming that, we may not know. We'll find a pile of remains and we may not be able to identify them, but presumptively based on where they were in the mamad or, in this particular kibbutz or whatever, we can presume who they might have been based on the location or things like that. That's going to happen here just like it was on 9/11. What's different from 9/11 is 9/11, we knew exactly how everybody died pretty much because we watched it basically unfold on television. In this case, even though there was video of some of the events, not everything was recorded. And there are many people that we don't know exactly how they died. And so the purpose of our job, in addition to helping identify them, is to document what exactly happened from a traumatic standpoint. So were they shot? Were they stabbed? Were they burned alive? All of those components, we are documenting what we see on the bodies and documenting the injuries, in addition to trying to figure out who they are.
So you're not just somebody trying to find out who are these people. You're also basically the only person or the first person to discover how they died. And then you can actually transfer that information to their families, which is important for closure or for knowing, for historical records. And just personally.
Absolutely. And this is the key thing is what we're doing is we're collecting evidence. And so the evidence can be used to help identify a person, but the evidence can also be used in any criminal or legal proceeding. So if, for example, there's an international tribunal or there's a need for testimony, that's also part of a forensic pathologist's job, is because we are trained in not only figuring out how people died, but also understanding mechanisms of injury. We're trained in explaining this to lay juries, explaining it to judges and lawyers.
I'm wondering, I'm not sure we could put this question in because it may be too gory. Have you seen evidence of the terrible ways that people were taught? I mean, I know that there was some evidence like that after the remains of I'm sorry if I'm triggering anybody here, of the burning, that they found like a chut barzel tied around the people. A wire, so that they knew that they were actually tied together. Is that something that you have seen?
So I'll be more circumspect if that's okay. In answering.
Okay, yeah, you can say it the way you.
Yeah, so I mean, without necessarily violating any kind of confidentiality, I can talk in generalities about the fact that everything that you've heard about that was documented on the videos, we saw proof of that from the bodies as well. And so I hadn't seen the videos until recently. At the time that I was working, I was just documenting what I saw in front of me. But I can, based on each individual case, tell you that we were just documenting what we saw, and it comported with what was on the videos and what people basically confessed to doing in the interrogation. And so this is the issue with regards, and I guess we can kind of transition to that former question that you had of if there's questions about the validity of what was actually collected or what was actually found, I can reassure you that not only was there myself and 3 other American doctors coming to help with identifying the remains, but there were also doctors there from Switzerland who were there as international monitors to observe the work and make sure that we were following international protocols and that everything was documented properly so that they could see what it is that we were doing and then be an external validating force. But more importantly, even if hypothetically somebody who's biased says something or documents something, we still have other ways of corroborating it. And we have ways of corroborating it from witness testimony. We have ways of corroborating it from the video the Hamas terrorists took themselves. We have CCTV footage from intersections in Israel where they have video camera to look for people who are speeding. And that also captured things. We have the people's own cell phone records where cell phones were taken into Gaza, for instance. So there is more than one modality that lends credibility to a forensic investigation. It's not just I said so and you have to believe me. It's I said so and what I'm saying is corroborated by 4 or 5 other pieces of evidence.
I see that you're online a lot. You have many, many followers on TikTok and you interact with people from all over the world. How does it feel for you to have seen these atrocities with your own eyes and your own hands, and then be confronted online with people who are either dismissing it or saying that it's fake? Does that affect you emotionally, or how do you deal with that?
Well, for one thing I know about online spaces is that algorithms amplify hate and they amplify divisiveness, because any algorithm that's designed based on popularity and engagement is going to get amplified when people are starting to argue with one another and call each other's names and go back and forth. So if I post a video and people are arguing back and forth in the comments, on the one hand, it is dispiriting, right? It's really upsetting when people argue and fight and can't come together, which is what we all want, right? We want people to be able to come together and acknowledge what the truth is. But at the same time, I know that if they're arguing with one another, it actually amplifies, more people will see my video. So that's the plus side of people arguing, is that more people will actually see what I had to say, and I just ignore the comments then. And, I sometimes debate whether or not to delete the really offensive ones. But in general, as long as people are being respectful of one another, then I leave it go, I let it be, because I figure it'll just amplify my original message and then more people will see what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Judy Melinek, for your time. This was a fascinating talk, and we've learned a lot about things that I'm not sure we would be studying if we weren't in this terrible, terrible situation.
Thank you so much. I also, when I was reading up about you and your life, you're really a very fascinating person from a personal perspective and also just from a professional perspective, and how those two combine is really important. Thank you for coming here and for sharing your expertise with us, even though it was quite I'm assuming, an emotionally difficult thing to do. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I think it's important.
I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. By listening to this podcast, you are a witness. Giving women's voices your attention means giving them power. If you, like us, agree that women's perspective are essential to the Israeli narrative, subscribe to the Voices of Women at Wartime wherever you get your podcasts, and encourage your friends to listen and subscribe too. And if you have thoughts, questions, or comments, we'd love to hear from you. So you can reach out to us on our social media at the Center for Women's Justice, on anywhere you get your social media.
Thank you, Rabbi Scott Kahn, for the recording and editing. I'm Rivka Lubitch, and I was here with Rachel Stomel. Stay safe.